Time in the city had become a malleable, unreliable force. I remember waking up to streets that shifted while I slept, buildings rearranged as though they were breathing, and faces I recognized morphing into strangers before my eyes. Each moment, I tried to anchor myself. The past and present slipped further apart. She moved through it all with a certainty that was both mesmerizing and terrifying, a puppeteer invisible yet omnipresent, rewriting events with the lightest touch. My memories were scattered fragments, like shattered glass reflecting distorted images of a life I once understood. I questioned if I had ever truly lived, or if everything had been an elaborate fabrication. The city, alive with neon and steel, hummed with the pulse of temporal anomalies. Pedestrians passed by, some looping through the same corridor as if caught. In an endless replay, others vanishing entirely, leaving only echoes behind. She spoke rarely, but when she did, her words seemed to bend reality. "You can't hold onto the past here," she said once, her voice slipping through the cracks of my mind. I tried to argue, to resist, to assert my existence, but the environment responded with subtle cruelty. A lamppost flickered in time with my heartbeat. A billboard displayed images of myself at places I had never visited. Every sensory cue was a challenge, every shadow a question. I began to track patterns, noticing the rhythm in her manipulations, the tiny inconsistencies that revealed the machinery beneath the city's facades. There were moments, brief and fleeting, where the streets stabilized, where memories aligned, and I could almost breathe. But these pockets of clarity were dangerous. They reminded me of what I had lost: coherence, trust, and the fundamental sense of self. She observed silently as I struggled, her presence both a guide and a tormentor. At times, I thought I saw empathy in her gaze, only to have it dissolve into something unreadable. Her motives were inscrutable, her morality unknowable. She was neither friend nor foe, simply a force of change, relentless, precise, and indifferent to the chaos left in her wake. Through countless attempts to anchor myself, I discovered that resistance required more than willpower. The city itself could be manipulative. Small gestures, imperceptible disruptions, could create temporary stability. I learned to mark spaces, leave traces of continuity, and carve out moments that she could not rewrite. But each success came with a cost. The deeper I delved into this temporal labyrinth, the more I risked fracturing my mind beyond repair. In one particularly harrowing instance, I followed her through a plaza that seemed ordinary, but as I stepped forward, every pedestrian froze mid-motion, suspended in an uncanny tableau. Time warped around us. Voices stretched, sounds elongated. She moved seamlessly through the scene, and I had to leap across gaps that appeared in reality itself. Each jump was not merely physical, but cognitive, forcing me to reconcile fragments of memory that contradicted one another violently. The city whispered its secrets reluctantly. I began to understand that her manipulations were not random. They were designed to test, to challenge, to refine. Each altered moment was a lesson or a trap, a question posed to the very core of my identity. I began documenting anomalies mentally, noting the areas where continuity could still be maintained. This became my map, my survival strategy, my small rebellion against the relentless erosion of time. Despite the terror and confusion, Moments of clarity revealed startling beauty. Neon lights reflecting in rain-soaked streets created patterns that felt almost intentional, a secret language embedded in the city's chaotic pulse. In these fleeting intervals, I caught glimpses of a world that might exist if the timeline could be stabilized, if the chaos could be harnessed rather than endured. These visions were fragile, ephemeral, but they offered a kind of hope, a proof that my identity could endure, even against forces designed to erase it. Yet the weight of disorientation pressed heavily upon me. Sleep became perilous. Dreams were contaminated by the city's distortions. I could no longer distinguish whether an experience was real or an insertion, a constructed memory meant to teach or confuse. The boundary between self and environment dissolved incrementally, and I began to wonder whether survival meant adaptation or surrender. She appeared one evening atop a building that overlooked the river, its waters reflecting impossible constellations. "Do you see it now?" she asked, voice calm, almost curious. The city stretched below us, twisted and reshaped, a living diagram of her interventions. I wanted to scream, to argue, to demand the truth of her actions. But the words faltered in my mouth. I realized that to confront her, I had to understand her logic, and her logic was not my own. The sun rose and fell with altered cadences. Days repeated, months skipped, moments folded into themselves. Every attempt to stabilize the timeline revealed new distortions. Each time I adapted, she adapted faster, pushing me further into the uncharted edges of perception. My mind began cataloging possibilities, creating contingencies against contingencies, until thinking itself became a survival exercise. Through it all, a question lingered: if she controlled every aspect of time, every thread of causality, what remained of my autonomy? Was I a participant, a prisoner, or something in between? The city offered no answers, only puzzles and fleeting glimpses of continuity, challenging me to navigate a reality that had no permanent foundation. And yet, amidst the chaos, a strange exhilaration arose. The struggle to maintain a coherent self against a reality in flux sharpened my awareness, forced me to notice the subtle structures underpinning existence. Every decision carried weight, every observation became a tool. The city, with all its shifting streets and rewritten moments, became both adversary and teacher, a crucible for the mind and spirit. As night fell, and the streets shimmered with phosphorescent light, I sensed her presence near but unseen. I understood then that this was not merely a struggle for survival, it was an initiation. Each fragmented memory, each altered moment, each confrontation with uncertainty was a step toward understanding a truth larger than the city, larger than the timeline itself. I did not yet know if I would emerge intact, or if my identity would finally dissolve into the infinite folds of manipulated time. But I knew one thing: I had to keep moving, keep remembering, keep challenging the distortions. For in this city, only those who actively resisted the alterations could hope to reclaim themselves, and perhaps reclaim the possibility of a timeline that made sense. The city never truly slept, yet every time I wandered its streets, I felt as if it exhaled and shifted beneath me. Moments I thought were linear fractured and folded, like crumpled pages of a book I could no longer read in order. Each corner, I turned revealed spaces that had never existed before, alleys that led to rooftops, staircases descending into nowhere, and plazas repeating themselves with subtle differences that gnawed at my sanity. I became acutely aware of the fragility of memory, how a single change could ripple through consciousness, altering not just the past, but my perception of the present. She moved with an elegance I could not mimic. Her presence was subtle yet invasive. Sometimes I would see her in the corner of my eye, a flicker in the periphery, and just when I blinked, she was gone. She existed in the seams of reality, the liminal spaces between moments, orchestrating events with a precision that was both terrifying and awe-inspiring. I tried to map her interventions, noting the anomalies, but every system I created to predict her movements was quickly outdated, overwritten by new distortions. Time became a tactile element, something I could almost feel pressing against my skin. Certain streets seemed to pulse, vibrating with echoes of moments that had not yet happened, or perhaps never would. The air itself felt thick with temporal interference, carrying the scent of ozone and static, as if the city itself was charged with an electric memory. I found myself listening to the rhythm of passing cars, footsteps, and machinery, trying to discern patterns, seeking a method to survive. Memories collided violently within me. I would recall a conversation that I knew had occurred yesterday, only to find it rewritten, the words altered, and the voices changed. Faces I loved, friends I trusted, sometimes were expressions that were wrong, too empty, too knowing, as if they remembered events I had no recollection of. Doubt became my constant companion, gnawing at the edges of my reasoning, forcing me to question whether I had ever existed independently of her manipulations, and moments of clarity. I realized that resistance was possible, but not in the ways I had imagined. Physical attempts to escape, to hide, or to confront her were futile. The city itself was an extension of her will. Instead, I had to engage with the city mentally, learning its rules, anticipating its shifts, and using subtle interventions to carve out spaces where my memory and identity could remain intact, however fleetingly. Each success was small but vital, a single thread of continuity in a tapestry she sought to unravel entirely. One night, I found myself atop a high rise, the city stretching beneath me like a living circuit board. Neon veins coursed through the streets, pulsing in patterns I could just begin to interpret. She appeared not by walking, but by emerging from the light itself, a form materializing in the fractured glow of holographic projections. Her eyes met mine, calm and unyielding, and for the first time, I sensed a trace of recognition, as though she acknowledged my attempts. Not with approval or judgment, but with a cold awareness of a force too vast to oppose directly. In the following days, I began to test boundaries. I planted false memories, tracing them through the loops of time to see where they would land. I left objects in places that should have been impossible to access, observing how they moved or vanished. Each small rebellion felt like a dialogue with her, an experiment in understanding the machinery behind her control. And yet, with every success, I felt her presence tighten around me, an invisible net constraining my perception, forcing me to adapt faster, think sharper, and endure longer. Sleep became a dangerous realm. Dreams were invaded by fragments of her manipulations, where I would relive moments with altered outcomes. People I knew would appear with unfamiliar motives, settings would warp and dissolve, and sometimes I would awaken unsure if the nightmare had been real or a fabrication. Inserted into my consciousness, the boundaries between sleep and waking, between what was mine and what was hers, blurred into a perpetual state of vigilance. In the city's plazas, I observed loops of events, witnessing the same pedestrians repeating the same actions with slight, maddening variations. It became clear that she tested the limits of perception, probing to see how much distortion could be introduced before an individual's sense of self fractured entirely. I realized I was part of a larger experiment, a subject within a living, breathing laboratory of time and memory. My mind, both instrument and canvas. Through careful observation, I discovered moments of resonance, pockets where time stabilized, briefly allowing continuity and coherence. These were precious, almost sacred intervals, and I learned to exploit them, leaving markers in the cityscape, signs only I could read, reminders of who I was and where I had been. Each small success was a victory, yet it was fragile. The city, like her, was always ready to reset, to fold, to erase. Even as doubt and fear pervaded my existence, a strange clarity emerged. The struggle against her manipulations sharpened my awareness, heightened my senses, and forced me to confront the raw mechanics of memory and time. Every interaction, every observation, every decision became a test of resilience. The city's distortions were no longer merely obstacles. They were instruments through which I could learn the rules of her world and perhaps find leverage. She never revealed her intentions. There was no promise of benevolence, no assurance of mercy, only the relentless tide of alterations. Yet in each fleeting moment of stability, I glimpsed the possibility of understanding her design. Perhaps control was not arbitrary but purposeful, a challenge meant to refine perception, to test endurance, or to teach in ways that defied conventional morality. In this fractured city, my identity became both weapon and shield. Each reconstructed memory, each conscious intervention, each moment I held onto myself was an assertion against the erasure that surrounded me. I began to see the city not only as a place of torment, but as a medium through which I could engage, resist, and perhaps ultimately reclaim my sense of self. Night fell once more, the neon lights refracting across rain-slicked streets. She appeared at the edge of a plaza, just out of reach, her silhouette blending with the shifting geometry of reality. I realized that this was an ongoing dialogue, a game of perception and will, one in which surrender was easy, but survival demanded strategy, attention, and courage. My mind, stretched to its limits, was my battlefield, the city, her instrument, and in the spaces between moments, I had to carve out the existence that remained undeniably mine. Time had become a labyrinth I could neither map nor predict. Each morning, I woke to a city that defied expectation, streets curling upon themselves, squares repeating like echoes, and the sky pulsing with unnatural light. Every corner concealed possibilities and threats, and every shadow seemed aware of me. She moved through this chaos with a grace that was both alien and infuriating. Her presence subtle yet inescapable, a force bending reality to her will. I tried to anchor myself through routines, Small gestures meant to impose stability, leaving marks on walls, arranging objects in familiar patterns, whispering reminders into empty corridors. But each attempt to impose order was met with subtle interference. A graffiti line I drew would shift overnight, letters rearranged, objects would disappear and reappear, subtly altered. These manipulations were not violent but insidious, forcing my perception to constantly adjust. The people around me were unreliable. Faces I recognized would flicker, morphing into strangers or collapsing into blank voids. Conversations I had yesterday would echo differently today, words changed, intentions rewritten. Trust became impossible. The city itself became my only reliable witness, yet it too was a malleable entity. Its memories fragmented and rewritten without warning. Sleep offered no reprieve. Dreams bled into reality, and reality intruded into dreams. I often awoke unsure if a memory belonged to the night before or had been planted by her hand. I began to document, mentally and physically, the anomalies, tracing the flow of altered moments to create a fragile network of continuity. This network was my lifeline, though I knew it could be undone in an instant. She appeared sometimes as a shadow, sometimes as light refracted in glass or neon. Her eyes seemed to see through my very essence, understanding every attempt at resistance. I began to sense her patterns. She did not act randomly. Each temporal distortion, every subtle shift was purposeful, challenging me to adapt, to survive, to think beyond linear time. In a moment of rare clarity, I discovered a small plaza where time held steady for brief intervals. I used these spaces to rest, to recalibrate my mind, and to assess the fragments of memory I had retained. They were fragile sanctuaries, allowing me to piece together who I had been and who I might still become. Each stabilization was temporary, yet vital. Without them, I would have succumbed to total disorientation. The city itself seemed to respond to my actions. Minor disruptions, subtle gestures of resistance, created ripples, revealing how deeply her influence penetrated every layer of existence. I became aware that survival demanded more than observation. It required engagement, careful manipulation, and the courage to act even when the outcome was uncertain. One evening, she led me through a corridor of impossibilities, staircases descending, into fog, walls breathing, and shadows that moved independently of their sources. Each step was a test of perception, each choice a measure of my resilience. I learned to anticipate her interventions, predicting how moments would shift and adjusting my behavior accordingly. The city was no longer just a landscape. It had become a dynamic participant in my struggle. Despite the fear, a strange exhilaration emerged. The constant challenge honed my awareness, sharpening every sense, forcing me to confront the mechanics of memory, time, and identity. I began to see patterns, small clues embedded in the shifting streets, subtle indicators of what had been altered and what remained. These insights were precious, forming the foundation of a fragile understanding that allowed me to navigate the chaos. I experimented with memory, deliberately leaving false recollections and observing their integration into the city's temporal fabric. Objects I moved would reappear in unexpected locations. Conversations I fabricated would echo in future encounters. Each experiment was both a test and a shield, a way to assert agency against a reality that constantly sought to erase it, never revealed her motives. Her presence was constant but opaque, a force without allegiance or empathy, guiding the city through alterations I could neither fully perceive nor control. And yet, her precision suggested purpose, as if every change, every shift, every fold in time was designed to communicate something beyond the immediate chaos. Through this endless struggle, I began to understand a fundamental truth. Identity was not merely a collection of memories, but an active process, a negotiation between self and environment. To survive here, I had to participate in that process consciously, shaping and reshaping my understanding with every step. The city, though chaotic and unyielding, became both adversary and teacher, a crucible testing my capacity for perception, adaptation, and resilience. Night descended, the neon city reflecting in puddles and wet asphalt. She appeared at the edge of my perception, and I realized that confrontation was not the point. Survival demanded awareness, flexibility, and an understanding of the underlying architecture of her interventions. I had no illusions about control, but in the delicate balance between chaos and coherence, I glimpsed the possibility of preserving a self that could endure, even within a reality designed to dismantle it entirely. The city's pulse became a rhythm I could feel in my bones, a constant reminder that time was no longer linear. Every street corner, every neon sign, every pedestrian was a node in a vast, invisible network she controlled. I walked cautiously, my senses hyper-aware, noting subtle distortions, a shadow that lingered too long, a reflection that didn't match movement, a word in conversation that felt implanted rather than spoken. These were the markers of her presence, the fingerprints of someone manipulating reality at its core. I attempted to create zones of stability, small areas where my memories could align with physical space. A bench in a park, a lamppost at the edge of a plaza, even a puddle reflecting the sky, all became reference points, anchors against the shifting tides. Yet she always found ways to challenge them, introducing minor variations, pushing me to question everything I thought I knew. The city itself was a labyrinth, alive with loops, false exits, and paths that existed one moment and vanished the next. Interactions with others were perilous. Friends, strangers, and strangers masquerading as friends all carried the potential for deception. Conversations looped, phrases altered, and motives shifted as though the people themselves were temporal instruments. Trust became a luxury I could not afford. I learned to observe, to anticipate, to test reality with small, controlled experiments, leaving objects in unlikely places, tracing anomalies, and watching the city respond. The nights were worse than the days. Darkness amplified the distortions, made the city's manipulations more visible, yet more incomprehensible. I often found myself trapped in loops, reliving moments with subtle but maddening differences. Sometimes a street I had walked yesterday would be entirely new today, yet familiar fragments would hint at repetition. Every step required vigilance. Every decision carried consequences that could reverberate unpredictably through the timeline. She appeared intermittently, often as a fleeting figure, a shadow among shadows. Her presence was almost imperceptible but impossible to ignore. She did not speak, did not acknowledge, but every action, every alteration, every subtle change was a message, a challenge, a test. I realized that understanding her methods was crucial, not to confront her, but to preserve my own identity amidst the relentless chaos. Through careful observation, I began mapping patterns in the distortions, finding minute consistencies that hinted at the underlying architecture of her control. Certain loops repeated predictably, some visual cues indicated resets. Sounds occasionally preceded the shifts. I recorded these in my mind, creating mental models of stability and change. Using them to navigate the city without losing grip on myself, memory became both weapon and shield. I deliberately planted recollections, experimented with false sequences, and monitored their impact on the environment. Each insertion was a small rebellion, a way to assert agency in a city designed to override it. The exercise required precision, patience, and a willingness to accept partial success or failure without knowing the consequences. I also discovered temporal corridors, moments where time seemed to slow, stabilize, or loop harmlessly. These were precious, fleeting opportunities to rest, consolidate memory, and plan next steps. In these intervals, the city's distortions became less threatening, and I could observe her influence more clearly, deciphering subtle shifts in structure, light, and movement. One evening, I reached a bridge overlooking the river, its waters reflecting neon and fractured skies. She appeared, materializing from the warped light, her eyes holding an inscrutable depth. No words were exchanged, yet I understood. This was a game of perception and endurance where every observation, every intervention, and every decision mattered. The city itself was her medium, the manipulation of time her language, and survival my test. Despite the fear and uncertainty, I began to feel an odd exhilaration. Every day I navigated loops, corrected false sequences, and maintained fragments of continuity. I was not only surviving but learning. The distortions sharpened my mind, heightened my awareness, and forced me to confront the essence of identity in immutable reality. I understood that to endure, I must adapt constantly, remain vigilant, and find leverage in the gaps she left. Spaces where human ingenuity could persist despite temporal chaos. I realized then that the struggle was not only against her, but against the very nature of the city, a dynamic, conscious entity shaped by her will. Each step, each memory, each intervention became a dialogue, an assertion of existence against forces intent on erasure. The city's beauty, terrifying in its complexity, revealed itself in brief flashes, a corridor perfectly aligned, a reflection of neon that held the past intact, a pedestrian moving predictably. These moments offered hope, evidence that continuity could exist, even in a reality designed to undermine it. And so I continued, navigating streets that folded and expanded, observing loops and anomalies, experimenting with memory, and anticipating her interventions. The city was both a prison and a classroom, every distortion a lesson, every challenge an opportunity. I did not know if I would emerge unscathed, but I knew that to stop moving, to stop thinking, was to lose entirely. In the delicate balance between chaos and comprehension, I clung to the fragments of myself, determined to endure. The city had become a living organism, breathing through loops and folds, a vast consciousness shaped by her manipulations. Each day, I observed it more closely, noting subtle changes in architecture, light, and movement. What had seemed chaotic began revealing faint patterns, almost imperceptible, yet persistent. I learned to recognize them, like reading a language written in angles and reflections, pulses of neon and echoes of footfalls. She was always near, yet invisible, a force embedded in the city itself. Sometimes I would catch glimpses of her in, reflections or shadows, fleeting images that vanished when I blinked. Her interventions were precise, deliberate, challenging me to react, adapt, and survive within the malleable fabric of time. Every step I took required acute awareness. Every memory needed verification. Every observation became a tool in a psychological battle for self-preservation. I began creating personal markers, subtle cues and symbols that helped anchor my identity in the ever-shifting environment. Notes etched into walls that would later be erased or transformed, small objects placed strategically, patterns of behavior and interactions with other people, all became my defenses against the city's continuous rewriting of reality. The markers were fragile but essential, allowing me to trace continuity and maintain a sense of self amidst temporal distortion. Sleep offered no sanctuary. Dreams were invaded by fragments of her manipulations, surreal episodes blending past, present, and possible futures. I awoke often uncertain of which memories were authentic, which had been altered, and which were implanted illusions. Nights were a labyrinth of perception and deception, a mental trial that left me exhausted but increasingly aware of the underlying structure of her influence. Interactions with the city's inhabitants were perilous. Faces changed subtly, motives shifted unpredictably, conversations looped or altered mid-sentence. I could trust no one completely. Instead, I observed, tested, and recorded patterns, using each encounter as data to refine my understanding. Even strangers became instruments in the city's complex, shifting design, and every decision carried potential consequences that could reverberate through altered timelines. She communicated indirectly through the city itself, a light flicker, a misaligned reflection, a repeated sequence in pedestrian behavior, all were messages, cues, or tests. I began deciphering these subtle signs, constructing mental models to predict and navigate distortions. I realized that resistance was not about confrontation but understanding, adaptation, and precise intervention. The city occasionally offered moments of stability, temporal corridors where loops paused and memory aligned. These intervals were precious, brief opportunities to consolidate identity and plan. In these spaces, I traced the traces of her manipulations, examining shifts in architecture, light, and sound. They were fleeting sanctuaries that allowed insight into the broader structure of the city and her influence. Experimentation became my strategy. I planted false memories, moved objects to test reactions, and traced altered sequences, observing how the city integrated and transformed them. Each experiment was both defense and assertion, a way to reclaim agency in an environment designed to strip it away. Precision, patience, and subtlety became my survival tools. One night, I found myself on a narrow bridge suspended above the neon-lit river. She appeared, a figure emerging from the refracted lights, her eyes calm yet implacable. No words were exchanged, yet the message was clear. Every perception mattered. Every act of observation was significant. Survival depended not on strength, but on awareness, resilience, and the ability to engage intelligently with the mutable city. Despite the exhaustion and fear, clarity emerged. Every intervention, every observation, every survival tactic sharpened my mind and heightened my perception. The city, though chaotic and disorienting, became a teacher. Each distortion, each manipulation, each loop was a lesson, challenging my understanding of identity, memory, and continuity. I learned to find leverage in the gaps she left, spaces where human cognition could endure amidst temporal chaos. I understood then that the struggle was perpetual. Control was an illusion, yet persistence was possible. By maintaining memory, interpreting anomalies, and navigating the shifting cityscape with precision, I could carve out a fragile but meaningful existence. The city was both adversary and classroom, her manipulations both trial and revelation. In this delicate balance, I held on to fragments of myself, asserting identity against erasure, determined to survive. The final stretches of the city's twisted avenues revealed the extent of her control. Time, once a constant, had become a malleable substance, flowing, folding, and snapping unpredictably. I moved carefully, observing subtle anomalies, a shadow that lingered too long, a neon sign flashing fragments of a memory that wasn't mine, a reflection that betrayed a moment already past. Each step required awareness, each choice demanded calculation, for even a minor misstep could erase my presence entirely. She was omnipresent in her absence, a force woven into the city's architecture. Hallways folded impossibly, staircases descended into mist only to emerge elsewhere, and bridges twisted into loops. Her interventions were precise, testing my perception and endurance, constantly reminding me of my fragility in this mutable reality. My senses were sharpened to the extreme. I learned to anticipate, to measure, to observe patterns in the chaos. Memory became both weapon and anchor. I planted subtle false recollections, tested the city's responses, and watched how reality bent around these alterations. Every interaction, every object moved or noted, became data for understanding the underlying logic of her manipulations. Survival required precision and patience, the ability to act decisively while knowing the consequences were uncertain and potentially catastrophic. The inhabitants were equally unpredictable. Familiar faces changed subtly, conversations looped or mutated, and motivations shifted without warning. Trust was impossible. Observation became essential. I recorded patterns, noting repetition, divergence, and irregularity, constructing a fragile mental map to navigate the shifting cityscape. Every encounter was a test, every response a measure of adaptability. Amidst the chaos, I discovered temporal pockets, moments where the city's distortions paused, offering fleeting clarity. These intervals allowed me to consolidate memory, analyze anomalies, and plan next steps. The city, though relentless, left openings for strategy and insight. These sanctuaries were ephemeral yet invaluable, revealing subtle cues about the mechanisms of her control. She appeared rarely, yet unmistakably, in fleeting reflections, warped lights, and sudden shadows. Her presence was an enigma, neither malicious nor benevolent, but authoritative, compelling engagement and adaptation. Understanding her influence was not about confrontation. It was about survival, perception, and the delicate assertion of self amidst constant rewriting of reality. Each day honed my awareness, sharpened my instincts, and deepened my understanding of identity as a process rather than a fixed state. I realized that selfhood was not merely remembered, but enacted, negotiated against the city's constant flux. My strategies evolved. Subtle tests, calculated observations, and careful manipulations of memory became essential tools for endurance. City itself seemed alive, responding to interventions, adapting to resistance. Small actions caused ripples, a note moved, a path chosen, a conversation subtly altered. These ripples were evidence that agency remained possible, even in a reality meticulously designed to erase it. Understanding these interactions became a form of empowerment, a means to assert existence within the mutable fabric of time. Finally, I reached a vantage point above the city, observing neon loops and streets folding into themselves. She appeared, emerging from warped reflections, her gaze penetrating. No words were needed, understanding passed silently between us. The city was both her instrument and her message. Survival, comprehension, and identity were intertwined, and the path forward required relentless attention, adaptability, and resilience. Though exhausted, I felt a quiet determination. The struggle against a reality designed to erase was ongoing, but awareness, observation, and subtle intervention offered hope. In the balance between chaos and continuity, between manipulation and resistance, I discovered that identity could persist, memory could endure, and agency, though fragile, remained. The city, in all its distorted grandeur, became a testament to both vulnerability and resilience, a crucible where the self was continuously tested and redefined. The city may rewrite everything, but your perception can define what remains. Subscribe now and step deeper into the mysteries that challenge reality itself. Witness the next twist in this interconnected universe, where every moment shapes identity and memory. Can you endure the unknown?